With this lesson, we're going to focus on adding and subtracting decimals, something that you may have worked with before.
So for the most part, it's going to be a little bit of a review. Our objectives are fairly straightforward. We want to be able to actually get the exact answer, not approximate like we were doing before, but get the exact answer when you add or subtract. Some things that we will be able to do with it, of course, for instance, we could get the perimeter of a triangle, and we also want to be able to visually represent either adding or subtracting. Of course, there are several skills we expect you to already have before you start this. You should know how to add and subtract whole numbers. You should know how to borrow when you subtract. You should know how to carry over when you add. Those aren't things that we're going to do here. We expect you to already know them. Essentially, we're looking at saying find the sum or difference.
Remember, the sum is the result after you've added, and difference is the result after you have subtracted.
So essentially all we're looking at saying is how do you add or subtract these decimals, and the one thing that you absolutely have to remember is to line up your decimal points. Whenever you add or subtract, if the decimal points are not lined up, you are going to have problems. And you'll also, of course, want to be careful about just your handwriting, because sometimes people's handwriting is so sloppy that they're trying to line up the decimals and then they don't come out that way, and they make mistakes just because they weren't careful with how they set it up. For instance, 5.7, we would need to recognize that there would be dead space 0, 5.70 after that. That way we've got the correct numbers lined up. 0 plus 6, 7 plus 3 would be 10, carrying over, and 1 plus 5 plus 3 gives us 9, so there's our answer, 9 and 600. Subtraction, of course, works the same way. We can see that decimals are all stacked on top of each other. They're lined up. That way when we get to our subtraction, we can borrow here. 12 minus 4 would give us 8. 6 subtract 8 requires us to borrow again, so 16 minus 8, and 11 subtract 3 gives us our answer of 8 and 88 hundredths. All right, a couple more examples. Again, putting in a dead space 0. 0 plus 5, 2 plus 8 gives us 10, so we'll carry over. 1 plus 1 plus 4 gives us 6. 4 plus 5 is 9. 5 plus 2 is 5. 3 plus 2 is 5. And 1 by itself, so we've got 159.605. We know that when we've got a whole string of zeros, 0 minus 1 you can't borrow, so we'll wind up coming over to the 2 and borrowing in a whole long chain. So 10 minus 1 is 9. 9 subtract 3 is 6. 9 subtract 4 gives us 5. Borrowing again, 11 subtract 9 is 2. And so we wind up with our answer, 22.569. Every single one of these, we've focused on having the decimals lined up right away. But when you're given a problem that's horizontal, you, of course, need to rewrite it. And rewrite it, paying attention, making certain that these decimals actually do get stacked on top of each other. That way we make sure we add the correct numbers together. 5 plus 0, 3 plus 4, 1 plus 1, 0 plus 0, and we're done.
Same thing. One part that I always recommend to students, don't crunch your numbers super close together. They don't need to be really tight. If you space out the numbers, giving yourself a little bit of room in between them, it makes it easier to keep them in line. 5 minus 0, we'll need to borrow. To get 10 minus 5, need to borrow. 13 minus 5 gives us 8, and there we're done. 0.855.
What about if we have a mixture of adding and subtracting? Here you have to keep in mind, when we have a mixture of adding and subtracting, there's a fact about the order of operations, which we've discussed. in particular, mixed adding and subtracting is done from left to right. Whichever one is farther left, that's the one you do first. This one has adding on the left, so we will do our adding first. And going through it quick, decimal stacked, 5 plus 1, 6 plus 3, 2 plus 2. Okay, so those sum to 4.96. From there, we can do our subtraction. 1.56, 6 minus 6, 9 minus 5, 4 minus 3, 4 minus 1, and so we get our final answer, 3.40. And we're finished. Of course, we know that the order of operations can also include parentheses. This is a problem where the subtraction is farther left. So normally we would do the subtraction because it's what's left. However, the parentheses get done before anything else. So 3.6 plus 4.2 will sum to 7.8. And 10 subtract 7.8. Well, where's the decimal? Keep in mind, if you don't see the decimal, it's understood to be at the end, and we need to use that to make sure that our decimals stay lined up and stacked. Thus, when we borrow off, 10 minus 8 gives us 2, 9 minus 7 is 2, we still get our final answer of 2.2. And I did mention we can use this to calculate the perimeter of a shape, like a triangle. Well, once again, what is perimeter? Perimeter is the distance around the outside. So to get the perimeter, we're just going to get the sum adding up all three sides. We have 10.5 plus 8.2 plus 4.1. And since this is all addition, you probably remember that these are things that we can get stacked on top of each other. Lining up all the decimals, because it's all addition, we can go through and do it all in one big stage. 5 plus 2 plus 1 gives us 8. 0 plus 8 plus 4 equals 12. 1 plus 1 is 2, and thus we get our final answer, 22 and 8/10 of a centimeter. Last problem for this video. How do you represent this stuff on a number line? How do you represent it graphically? The key feature that we're going to note, the first number is where you start. Adding and subtracting gives you a direction. We know adding goes to the right, subtraction goes to the left. And then the second one is how far you wind up moving. Now I want to point out the tick marks that I've got here. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The tick marks are arranged. You should of course recognize that since there are 4 tick marks per hole, that tells us that this is a number line set up in terms of fourths. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. So if we wanted to think of these in terms of fractions, we could. More generally though, we would remember as fourths, 0.25, 0.5, 0.75, 0.25, 0.5, 0.75, 0.25, 0.5, 0.75. So we're looking at 2.25, 2.5, 2.75, 3.25, 3.5, and so on. Well, what we would have to observe then, we would start at 1.75. That's where our first initial dot goes. Since we're adding, we're going to have to go toward the right. And we need to go to the right a total of 1.5. So quarter, 0.5, 75, 1 whole. Quarter, 0.5. This piece
leads us toward here.
And visually, what we're seeing is
We've got 1.75
for the starting value.
and then we've added 1.5, taking us toward the right, and it finishes here at 3 1/4.
And so we have a visual representation of how the adding is being done. Of course, there's so much work involved with this that the number line is less important than your skill in lining up the decimals, making sure that you know how to add, subtract, borrow when appropriate, follow the order of operations, and
Actually crunch your numbers.